For most of human history, there was no such thing as retirement. You worked until your body gave out, and then you hoped somebody would take care of you. In 1889, one man changed that forever, and he wasn't trying to be kind. He was trying to stop a revolution. Until the late 19th century, old age had no finish line. Farmers worked their fields until they couldn't stand. Miners kept descending into the same shafts long after their lungs had started to fail. Textile workers stayed at the loom until their hands simply stopped working the way they needed to. Dock workers loaded ships until their backs simply refused to bend anymore. Domestic servants worked into their 70s and 80s because stopping meant losing both their income and their home in the same afternoon. There was no pension, no savings plan, no golden years waiting at the end. When a worker's body finally failed, the options were brutal: lean on your children, beg for charity, or enter the poorhouse. In England, workhouses swallowed the elderly poor who had nowhere else to go. Grim, crowded institutions where survival, not comfort, was the only goal. Growing old wasn't a reward you earned, it was a race against your own body, and most people lost. There was one narrow exception, almost 2,000 years earlier. In 13 BC, the Roman Emperor Augustus paid pensions to legionnaires who survived 20 years of service. But it wasn't compassion either. It was a bribe to stop his own soldiers from turning against him. For almost 2,000 years after that, the idea simply disappeared. By the 1880s, Germany had a problem. Karl Marx had died in 1883, but his ideas hadn't. Socialist parties were surging across industrial Europe, gaining ground election after election despite years of bans and arrests. German workers, exhausted, aging, and unprotected, were exactly the audience that message was built for. Bismarck had already spent years trying to outlaw the socialist movement outright through his anti-socialist laws. The pension was built to run alongside that ban, the carrot next to the stick. If the state didn't take care of its workers, someone else would promise to, and that someone would arrive carrying a red flag. In 1881, at Bismarck's urging, Kaiser Wilhelm I sent a letter to the German parliament. It said that those disabled by age had, in his own words, a well-grounded claim to care from the state. It sounded like compassion. It wasn't. Bismarck said it himself plainly to the Reichstag. "Call it socialism, or whatever you like. It is the same to me." This wasn't generosity. It was a calculated move to make the empire more appealing than the revolution. In 1889, the law passed. Workers who reached 70 and could prove they were too disabled to keep working would receive a state pension. Here's the detail almost nobody knows. Average life expectancy for a German man at the time was around 40 years old. Bismarck himself was 74 when he built the system. Most workers who paid into it for their entire working lives never lived long enough to collect a single mark. This wasn't a reward for a long life. It was a promise most workers were never expected to cash. There's a popular story that the retirement age of 65 comes from Bismarck's own age when he built the system. That's false. The original age was 70. It wasn't lowered to 65 until 1916. 27 years later, and 18 years after Bismarck had already died. The number that would define the end of working life for the next century was mostly bureaucratic accident, not deliberate design. Other nations watched Germany's experiment and one by one copied it. Denmark introduced its own old age scheme in 1891. New Zealand followed in 1898, though applicants there had to appear in open court and convince a magistrate they were of good moral character before a pension would be granted. Britain waited until 1908. Australia followed a year later. Within 20 years, an idea built to fight off one specific socialist movement in one specific country had reshaped the expectations of old age across the entire industrialized world. The United States, though, already had a preview of what happens when a promise like this grows faster than anyone plans for. Decades before Social Security, the federal government had committed to pensioning every Civil War veteran, and by 1893, that single program was consuming roughly 40% of the entire federal budget. It was a warning nobody was paying attention to yet. The idea for ordinary workers didn't take hold in America until the Great Depression, when Social Security arrived in 1935 and adopted 65 as its own threshold. At the time, average life expectancy for American men was still under 65. The system, again, wasn't built assuming most people would use it for long. Private companies followed the same logic. American Express offered the first private pension in 1875. By the 1920s, railroads, oil companies, and banks had joined in, not out of loyalty to workers, but to attract scarce labor and quietly retire older employees to make room for younger, cheaper ones. Within a few decades, something remarkable happened. An idea invented as a political weapon against socialism quietly became one of the most sacred assumptions of modern life. Retire at 65, collect a pension, rest at the end of a long working life. Companies handed out gold watches to mark the moment, a small ceremony for a stage of life nobody questioned anymore. Nobody asked where the number came from. It simply became the shape of a human lifetime, as if it had always been there. But the math that made retirement possible has quietly broken. Bismarck's system assumed most workers would die before collecting. Today, life expectancy in most developed countries sits close to 80, meaning modern retirees can live 20, even 30 years past the age they stop working, decades the original architects never planned for. In 1960, roughly 5 working adults supported every retiree drawing a pension. Today, in many wealthy nations, that ratio has fallen below 3 to 1, and it keeps shrinking. This isn't just history either. In 2023, the French government tried to raise its own retirement age from 62 to 64. Hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets. Strikes shut down trains, schools, and fuel depots for months. Germany is feeling it too. The same country that invented the promise is now raising its own retirement age back towards 67, with newer proposals pushing it as far as 70 by the end of this century. The exact number Bismarck chose in 1889, the one nobody was ever supposed to reach in the first place. Pension systems built for a world where almost nobody lived long enough to use them are now straining under the weight of people living decades longer than anyone predicted. And the fight Bismarck once started to buy off a revolution is now the fight governments are having to end one. Retirement feels like it has always existed, like it's simply what happens at the end of a life. It isn't. It's barely 137 years old, built by one chancellor, for one political fight, using a number nobody was ever expected to reach. The stage of life you're planning your entire future around wasn't discovered. It was invented, and like every invention, it can still be unmade. The chancellor who built retirement to stop one revolution might not recognize the one now being fought over it. Whatever age is sitting in your own retirement plan right now, ask yourself where that number actually came from. Because odds are, nobody who built it expected you to need it for as long as you might.
And
If stories like this change the way you see the world around you, subscribe. There's a lot more hiding in plain sight.